literally, I learned quantum mechanics as a physicist before I learned anything about my emotions. And I don't think that should ever happen in society. I think we should all be learning very foundational things about being a human being, the fullness of the human experience, what's available, and why we feel the way we feel, and actually come into terms of deep kindness and self-compassion for the way that we feel instead of believing that we're broken.
Welcome to Vibration Translation from Spiritual Awakening, Spiritual Integration, the present moments, and our authentic interaction with what is right in front of us, right now. All right, hello everybody, welcome back. Today's guest is Jeff Lieberman. I think that's how you say it. He is an artist, engineer, musician, and co-founder of Sleepaway Camp. Sleepawake is a wellness, emotional, relational healing, nervous system reprogramming camp for young adults. There's a lot that goes on in this camp. I went there for 30 days and I was promised an ayahuasca experience, and I got an ayahuasca experience without the ayahuasca, so it was for real like that. He's also the creator of a wonder machine. So these are like optical illusions that break the expectation of human perceptions. And the aim of this is to allow the stillness and wonder to emerge when the expectations are broken. He also created the new map of human experience. And this map integrates domains of psychology, physics, evolution, and spirituality within the subjective human experience. So that's what I got on you, Jeff. What do you have anything to add? Was that good?
That's great. Yeah, just that it's a pleasure to be here and get to chat after you having gone through camp and just kind of see where your curiosity leads us.
Yes. So yeah, I went to just briefly, I went to sleepaway camp. Was it how many? Was that like 4 or 5 months ago now?
Yeah, yeah, we're 5 months ago.
Yeah. How would you define sleepaway? Because I always had trouble putting into words
Mm.
what's like sleep awake into like a sentence. Like that's quite challenging for me. What would you say as the co-founder?
I feel it even 4 years into the project. It's still really hard to put words on because I think what we're pointing to is so ineffable on some level. But the best words I have for it in this moment are we tried to design a program that would teach young adults all the things that we think all adults should have learned, but very few of us actually learn about thriving as an adult. We kind of learn whatever our family happens to teach us and whatever our community happens to teach us. And it's kind of a roll of the dice what you get. You know, people get very different outcomes from that. And our culture, if you look at the statistics, is not doing that well in terms of mental health. We're on the rise of depression and stress and anxiety. We're not going down, even though technology is getting better and better. And so to me, that means there's unexplored territory and there's things that people aren't learning about wellness that they really should be. And that's everything from nervous system regulation, how to have conflict in more healthy ways, how to set boundaries so you don't live in resentment and obligation, how to have deeper metacognitive awareness of yourself, deepen your concentrative ability, uh, widen your creative expression and get the uniqueness of your voice out in the world, be more vulnerable in your connection so you actually feel connected and cared for in your community, which is really deep in terms of mental health. So it's a very, very cross-dimensional program that tries to address really all the dimensions that all of us should really learn. And I built it, it was kind of born out of frustration of what I wish I had been taught myself when I was in my 20s.
Right. One of my questions was actually like, what was the main, like if there was a main pain point or inspiration for creating Sleep Awake? Like for you personally, is there like something specific, like loneliness or I don't know, what could it be?
Oh yeah, very clear answer because I had deep depression in high school and college and at times suicidally deep depression. And when I was 17, which would have been in the mid 90s, when I went to go see a therapist about that, they said, okay, well, you have depression and you have obsessive compulsive disorder, and here's some pills. And there's a journalist, Johan Hari, who studies depression, and he says all those kind of conversations are are using a model of malfunction. They're saying that your chemicals are off, and so you need to put other chemicals in there, and then you'll feel better. And that whole idea, you know, the message underneath that is that you're a machine that's broken and that these other things will fix you. And it took me a lot of soul searching and retreats and other programs to start to realize that my depression was actually the intelligent response to the conditions in which I grew up, family and society and et cetera. So uh, it took a long time to move from this model of I have something wrong with me and I'm broken in some way to actually this is an intelligent response to the conditions in which I was grown. And that's a very different stance to take. Depression, and just to like really reify it, depression means something is being held in or held down. And you don't hold things in or hold things down unless it's wise to do them in certain environments. And I know anyone, for example, anyone that holds in their sadness, it's because the environments they grew up in couldn't handle well the feelings of sadness. And so it's wisdom to hold those things in. But then you're an adult, you're not in the same house anymore, but your nervous system holds all those beliefs and waits, and it doesn't have new evidence to say, actually, my sadness is welcome now, or my fear is welcome now. And so that took a long time for me to find my way through. And it literally was like Google searching about happiness and then going to these retreats. And, it took like 10 or 15 years to find my way through that. And once I did, I said, this should not be the way that it happens for anybody. People should get the tools and the skills to understand the intelligence of their emotions, how to feel them, how to work through them. And it's way more important than 99% of the other things we learn when we're in education. The line I tell a lot of people is literally, I learned quantum mechanics as a physicist before I learned anything about my emotions. And I don't think that should ever happen in society. I think we should all be learning very foundational things about being a human being, the fullness of the human experience, what's available, and why we feel the way we feel, and actually come into terms of deep kindness and self-compassion for the way that we feel instead of believing that we're broken.
Yeah, and actually, with for me, like when it comes to learning and education, I had a lot of constructs that built around that, around how I should be learning, that I should be taking all these notes, and this is the way that I should be learning, or I should be learning like, I don't know, I used to like study Einstein or whoever, and I was like, oh, I need to be like them, like they're the geniuses, like I'm not, I need to be like them, I need to do the Sudoku puzzles so my parents think I'm smart instead of playing video game, like but I did play video games, but I wanted to like pretend like all I did was like the smart stuff because I felt like that's what I needed to be. And I feel like that really stunted my ability to even allow myself to learn how I naturally would learn without all the emotional blockages and should be's about how I'm supposed to be and who I'm supposed to be and what success is. I mean, all of that stuff goes together. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's
yeah.
tiring. There's a researcher, I believe he was at Harvard, named Howard Gardner, and he's the guy who came up with a thing called multiple intelligence theory, where I believe there's 9 totally different areas of intelligence that are all really valid and all very different. And so someone who grows up and they're a genius kinesthetically, like they're meant to dance in their life. And they go through our school system, which was designed to create factory workers 150 years ago in Prussia, and we haven't really updated the system of education. Um, that person is not going to be very satisfied. And of course, especially when you're 5 years old and you have all this energy and it's trying to be channeled in a very specific way. If your natural intelligences want you to be moving in your body, uh, this is not a well-suited environment for you. And I think more and more we're starting to wake up to the fact that people have very different intelligences and that it's only one sliver that wants to be learning about state capitals and math, and it's other things that we really want to be embodied beings. Most of our history is about being social mammals, not being human beings. And so we still need those kind of mammalian level skills and ways to connect with each other.
Right. And we have this, I don't know who said it, but the idea of us being a society of like talking heads, or just like the head is all that there is and everything else is like 1% and we don't care about it.
Mhm.
Um, I forgot what I was
Yeah.
gonna say there, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. We're very I think it's hard to even have some discussions about some of the things we do at camp to people who are so living above the neck that it's a scary place to go back in the body. We've left the body for good reason at times. And as as from being in the program, it's like we offer things every day at camp that are scary. And it's
Yeah.
not that they're foundationally scary, it's that they're scary because they're counter the norms that we have all grown up in.
Yeah, and especially like I was very like hermit all of my life, and I discovered spirituality when I was like 12 or 13. And so I started getting into the stuff, but by myself, because when I would share it at the time, my parents weren't open to it. Now they're all into it, but like at the time, they weren't. So I'm like, oh, I need to do all this all by myself. Nobody's going to understand. And then I fell into the narrative of, oh, nobody understands me. And then I don't trust anybody. And then all that came up during camp. Yeah, because it's like, I'm not used to even being around people for that many days without having a way to just not be around. I mean,
Totally.
and that was very like new to me, and so just the fact that we were in a group, and this wasn't this wasn't a solitary experience of you go into like some retreats, like I don't know, silent retreats or whatever, where it's very like focused on the self, focus on, because I feel like I could do that and I would be so much more comfortable and so much more also stuck in a story, because I've come to realize for myself that like there's things I can't do alone, and things I don't know if it is that I can't be. Maybe there's some things that we can't be alone because that's what we are together. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's beautiful to hear. I mean, I think you and I have an overlap where there's been a sense of aloneness and there's been a need to kind of go into our own space to find like, okay, I'm with myself. I can find ease here, right? So we find this like local max. We find a situation that is what's on offer to us to be relaxed. And we have to do some work to actually find that in community. It's not been comfortable for us. And so um, yeah, it requires moving into resistance. It's not comfortable. But then that's when we start to actually disconfirm our history. What Irvin Yalom calls disconfirming evidence. We're looking for what happens in camp all the time is that you go into a situation that used to not be okay, and your nervous system fully predicts that it's not going to be okay. And then you actually do the thing and you find out people move closer to you instead of moving further away or punishing you or being abusive. And all of a sudden, the nervous system is the thing that learns. It's not your mind, neck up,
Hmm.
that's like, oh, yes, here's a new fact about the world. Your nervous system starts to learn. And when we learn these patterns through relationships, through family and community, we have to heal them through relationships. We can't just do this in a cave. And a lot of people that have especially trauma around aloneness and needing to be alone because the community wasn't being supportive, a lot of those people end up doing meditation and deluding themselves that they're actually finding freedom when what they're finding is a way to medicate themselves and insulate from the challenges.
Yeah, I resonate with that because it's like when I start exposing myself to an environment of literally being around another person, all of a sudden all the things that wouldn't get triggered when I'm by myself because I'm in my own environment come up. And how would you say that this somehow relates to your map of human experience, like at the lower levels where it's like, or could you just give like a quick overview for people of what your map is about and the
Hmm.
levels it go through, just real quick?
Sure. So first I'll say any map that tries to purport to explain the dimensions of human experience has to really cover some ground, right? And I made this map because we take for granted that we have maps for all these different things. Like we know the periodic table to understand. When I learn the periodic table and I look around the room, what deep insight I have. Oh, all of these things are made of molecules that are made of atoms, and there's a finite number of atoms, and they have these structures. Like that's so incredible. Like that wasn't around for most of our history that I can have that insight. And we have maps of the body, like the circulatory system and the immune system, and what an amazing intuition that gives us for what's going on. And what really struck me is that we never learn a map for the dimensions of our experience. We kind of are flying blind. We're having day-to-day experiences, we're having thoughts, we're having emotions, we're having perceptions, but we're also having different kind of senses of self. Like everyone feels like they're somewhere in here looking out. Most of the people in the Western world feel like they're kind of behind their eyes. Um, but we also have a sense of the roles that we play, which are not the same as the thoughts that we're having. We also have an ability to witness our thoughts. And so it's like this infinite amount of complexity of our experience. And my goal in making the map was, how do you find the minimum set of things that feel independent from one another? You know, like my thoughts feel independent from my sense of sight, for example. It's very clear that I can delineate those. So what's the minimum set of those dimensions that exhaustively explains the fullness of human experience? So that's something it's like a pet project for the last 5 years, to try to make deeper sense of the complexity of human experience myself. And I'll just say, you know, for anyone that's interested in this kind of stuff, this is very hard to just talk about through audio. It's a very kind of visual kind of learning for me, at least. And actually, if you're watching this, this is a poster of that map
Oh
in its
yeah.
latest iteration. So I can walk through really rudimentarily and really quickly, but I'd invite people to watch an hour and a half long talk I gave on it online that's on YouTube, or you can go to theopensource.life, and that has the poster and it has, you know, the talk. But very, very overview, a rudimentary overview, I'd say the 7 dimensions that I found that are pretty exhaustive in explaining things is that you have, I'll try to do this like a weatherman. You have individual sensations. So this is where the 5, you know, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, proprioception, interoception, all those kind of things start. And those independent firings have no structure to them, but they start to actually form flows with one another. They form perceptual flows. So now I'm seeing Maya's face, right? That's a very complex thing already, but it's millions of separate inputs that are being combined together into perceptual flows. Those flows, as they get complex enough, they start to form new kinds of structures. And the most complex structure that they form is a sense of being a perspective, right? So right now, if I point to where I feel like my perspective is coming from, it's like an origin point, and it's like a 3-dimensional coordinate system that is surrounding me, right? That doesn't happen in a jellyfish. It has a way of getting around the world that has no sense of being in a certain place, just movement. And that's really anti-intuitive. But once I'm in the evolutionary phase of being like a frog, I've actually constructed a 3-dimensional reality, and now I'm moving through it. I have a whole model of that. So once I can identify that I'm in a certain place and the world is around me, then I can start to identify other individuals that exist in that place. So now I'm an entity, and so is Maya. And when Maya is there and I'm here, now there's a whole new kind of social flow that can happen. And that's where the social emotions evolve from. And so the second flow up here on the 4th level is the flow of emotion. And that starts with the earliest mammals, like, you know, the rats and later dogs and eventually chimpanzees, where there's a social cohesion. And that feels very different than just sight, right? When I feel actually pulled towards another person, like I want to talk to this person, that's a social emotion. Now, when I have that kind of flow over time, and I find that the social structures get more and more complex, then the 5th layer appears, which is that I start to have my own unique role. You know, and maybe I'm the leader of the pack as a dog, or maybe in modern society, I'm the cobbler, right? But that role starts to become not just a set of actions, but it's a set of beliefs about myself and how I interact and what the rules of interaction are that I can follow. So that's the 5th layer that comes on, is really the personality. In my case, it's Jeffness. And what I would say is this layer is just being here. And that has nothing to do with Jeffness. Jeffness has to do with having a past and having certain identity features in my personality. Like I'm the kind of person who had depression, or I'm the kind of person who feels alone in this world. And that's not an individual thought. It's a nature of myself. And so Maya's personality and Jeff's personality are different based on our conditioned history. When I have that sense of personality and I build up a really complex architecture in the brain, then I can start to have symbolic thought. And so the 6th layer is the layer of symbolic thought. And thought starts, you know, if you see language and its evolution, you see dogs barking, and that's like, you know, a kind of a language that has maybe 10 words in it, where there's different kinds of barks that signify danger or food or whatever. Now we have 200,000 words in the English language because of the complexity of symbolic thought. And those words can mean things like love, which is so abstract to be able to point to something with a bunch of curved letters that say something like love, right? It's not that there's food right in front of me. It's now I can arbitrarily get complex in my symbolic thinking. So that's the 6th layer. And then separate from that, but built off of that, is metacognition, the ability for self-reflection and self-awareness. So now I can actually have thoughts, but now I can see that thoughts are happening. And that's a whole different process of witnessing that sits on top of thoughts. So that's a very, very lightning fast, rudimentary way to go through how these dimensions all feel different, but they sum total into the fullness of human experience. And then the relationships between these and the complex feedback systems that come from those relationships uh, seems, in my experience, to cover the fullness of what humans can experience. And every time I talk to people, I try to find, do you have any counterexamples of something that's happened in your experience that doesn't fit into this? Now, it's worth just reiterating, like, we're so used to making maps of things, like the periodic table is about atoms, and this is just about experience. And it's a kind of an interesting experiment for someone to do themselves, to just feel into, like, if I didn't have what I just said, you know, how would you structure like the dimensions of your experience, like the foundational different aspects, so that you could kind of make sense of it and find your way around? And that's what started this whole thing for me, was just the puzzling fact that we're not taught anything like that.
Right. Thank you for going into that. And I'll link the full video down below. Super awesome.
Cool.
And
It's a
so
mouthful. It's a lot to
right.
grok on a first pass. It requires a lot of looking to get intuition on.
So each of these points you call lavars, and lavar 5, which is like the personality, and you
Mhm.
mentioned like it's like the conditioned history. Now we have the personality. So I feel like that one, there's so much. Now I might be concentrating on this one too much, but I feel like there's so much to be said about just that one lavar, because I can, like, even like just right now as I'm talking to you, I can have all of my like conditioned voices based around the situation come up from a past version of myself. Like who am I speaking to Jeff on this podcast? Or why oh, I can't put my information as well as Jeff. Why would I be talking to him? Or
Mm, mm.
I'm not capable, or like all those voices. And you mention something called grab, or like a grab of content, like the content in our reality and the information presented to us, like a person listening to this podcast right now or watching this podcast can get grabbed into any, I guess, any sensory, any relational, any social, any aspect of this video. They can just really start getting grabbed or sucked into that.
Mhm.
Um, and you mentioned in that uh, 90-minute video that grab of content can be undone with simple attention focused training. And so, like,
Not
my
simple,
what?
but attention focused, right? Yeah.
Right, okay, this attention attention focused training. So, when it comes to like getting sucked in to any of these levels of experience, or especially when it comes to our patterns and like what I just mentioned, like, oh, I'm not capable, blah blah blah, whatever I might think of myself in this situation based
Mhm.
on a past version of myself, like, can we just, quote unquote, like just release on repeat, or is it a matter of time, of permissioning, or willingness? Because
Mhm.
sometimes I feel like, and this has to do with like to be able to release this pattern or an assumption that we're having in our reality. Sometimes I feel like I okay, sometimes I feel like, for example, I can have that thought come up of, oh, I'm not capable. But I can recognize that I have this thought like through metacognition awareness and be like, okay, that's
Mhm.
not true. Like I can push that away. But I feel like some people might call that bypassing, because if the emotional
Right.
work hasn't been done around that to a certain extent, then I feel like that is bypassing. But if you already kind of dived into the emotion behind that, you like the work is in just quote unquote releasing that whatever comes up that doesn't feel good for you. What do you think on that?
Yeah, you're asking a very complex and deep question. Um, and the whole topic is very complex. We could easily spend the rest
Yeah.
of the time just talking about this one question. So I don't want to pretend to give an exhaustive answer. In a first answer, we can talk about it as much as it's of interest. It's very possible that someone can use attentional training to bypass things like that. And the real question, that if someone wants to check if that's happening, is they could say, well, how much resistance would I actually feel if I let myself feel that feeling all the way? You know, if I feel helpless and alone in a situation, I might see, oh, there's just a voice in my head that's saying I'm helpless and alone. Um, and that's not really what's going on now. I might have a light relationship with it and just be able to let it go. Oh, that's just an imprint from my past. Um, but if I was truly doing that without bypassing, then if I was feeling helpless and alone, I'd be willing to feel helpless and alone. The real kind of proof in the pudding is like the resistance I would have if I went toward the feeling. And, you know, I've noticed huge changes in my own internal resistance to feeling different feelings in the body. You know, I used to be so much in resistance to my anger that it was completely unconscious that I had any anger, which is very common in our culture because we very often repress anger. It's not really allowed. And we're not taught about the healthy aspects of anger, like being able to say no to something that's not okay with us. So that's important. It's an important skill. It's the terrible twos are all about learning how to say no and put boundaries in places. But if you were punished when you got angry and put in your room until you quieted down, you're surely not going to learn how to do that healthily. But there are pathways to actually, as you grow up, to learn how all these emotions are serving you and they're intelligent in their own way. So there's a deep intelligence in learning how to welcome them as information. And that's something that most of us never learned. We know how to welcome certain things, and then we get into what many people call spiritual materialism, where we think that the way to get really happy is to get as far away from all the negative emotions, and that there's some practice that will let us never feel sad and never feel angry, instead of that I can be free of the resistance. And that's a whole different stance. The fact that I can be free of resistance to the flow of emotion in my life, because situations are going to happen. This body is going to get sick. It's going to die. That's just the way of life. And if I'm spiritually materialistic, I'm trying to get rid of that fact my whole life and just like point towards the light at the expense of putting things deeper into my unconscious. So when you talk about the example of like uh, feeling unworthy, so one of the things that happens through doing the real work, you know, doing the work on our conditioning, or what Doug Tatarin calls our accidental conditioned history, because all these things just happen because of where you were born and where you grew up. And for me, for example, one of the deepest ones was I'm alone. I'm alone here because there were a lot of times where I really felt alone as a kid. And one of the things that happens is if I can be in a situation with other people in my community or with a therapist or a coach, and they are willing to be with me while I feel that aloneness fully, and I can say and put into words and connect my head with the sensations in my body and with my heart, and I can feel I'm alone here, and then I can be met. What tends to happen is I'll start to disidentify from the feeling. I'll feel that aloneness so much that I'll start to be able to notice that it's a feeling and that it's not me. And you kind of alluded to this, but just to make it really crisp, what tends to happen is I'll feel alone. I'll say I'm alone, and I'll feel the. It's a really hard feeling to feel if it hasn't been okay in our lives, aloneness, you know. But over time, what will naturally happen is instead of me saying I'm alone, I'll start to say I feel alone. And
Hmm.
already in that, there means there's a me, and then there's an aloneness that's coming in and out as a feeling. And that's a huge change because now it's not the bubble that's surrounding me. And just to connect all this to where you started by talking about grab, right? If you want to understand grab, you look at a 3 year old that's having a temper tantrum, right? A 3 year old who doesn't want to put their shoes on is fully inside the bubble of the reality that this is a real problem, that having my shoes have to be put on is the end of the world, right? That's why
Yeah.
there's a tantrum, right? But from the outside, you can kind of be chuckling, you know, that there's much bigger problems in the world than having your shoes on. So that's a sense of lack of grab, just as contrast. As the parent, you can say, "Oh, look how funny this is." You know, if you're still within your tolerance of patience, you could say, "Okay, look how grabbed this toddler is." This also happens in talking with friends. It's like I think the biggest time that we tend to remember as adults is puberty, when we are like 15 and we are just like feeling this person, and their response to us totally changes our sense of the world is good or the world is bad based on if this person smiled at me or didn't smile at me. That's grab. My perception of reality, I'm totally inside the bubble that it's real. And what happens here is the total determinant of how I am. Now, later on in life, I can actually move through the kind of feelings of that, and I can still have attractions and repulsions toward people, but their reactions to me are their own. They don't necessarily grab the fullness of my well being, right? And ideally, less and less do they determine my well being. And my well being is for me to determine. And then people move through the world as they move, and I don't need them to be a certain way to make me happy. So that's a really kind of a deep aspect of grab.
Right. And I'm just curious because right now I'm working with kids with special needs and like like the kind of temper tantrums and like explosions, especially of anger that come out are like very I mean like pushing chairs over, pushing tables over, like trying like you have to like stabilize them or they're gonna hit you sometimes. And I'm just curious like at what age can like this metacognitive awareness come in so they're not so inside the experience. But also it's
Mm,
hard with
mm,
like sometimes like really violent expressions of anger because I mean the way I see it done in my school is I mean if a kid is cursing off and disturbing the entire class they'll be taken to another class with a teacher until they calm down. I don't know if that's
right.
the best way. I really don't know, so I'm just curious about
Yeah.
your perspective on that.
Yeah, so first I'll give like a disclaimer. I don't have any training in special needs development, so I can't speak towards that aspect of it. But if you look at a normal 3-year old that's normal on the developmental
Right.
spectrum, they're going to have tantrums all the time. And that's a normal part of growing up. And if you think about it, it's actually makes a lot of sense because as an animal, you don't have to be trained about like how your culture is like because there aren't cars going in the street where you actually have to be restrained from running into the street. Like that's something that you have to teach a child to not run in the street, but the freedom in the child wants to do whatever it wants to do. So it's a
Yeah.
process of domestication. Like bringing an animal into humanness is a process of domestication, and there's going to be resistance to that because the child just wants to do whatever it wants to do.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and that's beautiful, right? And so there shouldn't be the expectation that that 3-year-old has metacognitive awareness of what's going on, because in the development of a child it goes from complete and utter dependence on a different containment, which is from the parents, and the more fully and easefully and lovingly, unconditionally lovingly that the parents hold that growing up domestication process, the more that that child will become independent and have good metacognitive awareness of the processes going on inside him or herself. So there's this really like handing over of the reins of control over, the first 20 years of a life. And at 3 years old, there shouldn't be any expectation that that child understands yet what process is going on inside them because the process is new, right? At 2 years old, they're learning anger. They're learning how to say no. If you look at a 1-month-old child, there's no access to that yet because there isn't even a world model to get angry at. There's just the terror of, I don't have my needs met. So I just wail. That's all I can do when I'm really a newborn. So things like anger come in, and we'd be skipping a lot of steps if we expected the 3-year-old to understand that. What the 3-year-old needs is they need to safely be able to go through all of that while being held in a loving way
Hmm.
that doesn't try to shut down that energy, but also doesn't allow it to cause hurt and pain. So it's finding that right boundary for the behavior, and it's understanding like, of course you feel this tantrum, and of course you're unhappy, and I'm going to be here with you, and I'm going to keep you from hurting yourself or anyone else. But then when the tantrum ends, you're going to still be in connection with me. You're not going to be alone in your room being punished, so that you learn to never let that feeling come in more. You're going to learn that there are certain ways that the world is, and that we have to be in order to be safe, but that's not going to lose connection. You're not going to lose connection because you feel that.
Hmm.
And if a child can go through the whole arc of a tantrum and on the end be held in connection still, over time that will channel into someone who knows how to use their anger. And someone who knows how to use their anger is, oh, what's happening right now doesn't feel good for me. That's healthy anger. It's the ability to say no to things. And so many of us don't know how to do that because we're afraid of the, you know, retaliation or punishment for it. And so we constantly live in a world of enmeshment, codependence, obligation, resentment. This is the kind of a normal thing in our culture is that we do things out of obligation, and then we resent the people that
Mm-hmm.
are asking us to do them instead of just saying, actually, I'm a no to this. It doesn't feel good for me.
Yeah.
And
And
what's
then we blow
amazing is
up.
to, and then we blow up. Yes, exactly. Then we blow up.
Confirming that
So,
anger isn't safe. Because that's
yeah,
the
exactly.
trigger is crazy at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, we build up the pressure and the balloon pops, and it's hard because most of the time all of our friends are doing the same thing. And so to be the first one to start updating that model means that everyone has to have new contracts in their relationships, and so that can cause discord in communities and et cetera. So um, it's not easy to be the first one in the community to shift that. But when the community at large starts to understand, actually, we're not taking enough care of ourselves, and all of us could be taking better care of ourselves, acting less out of obligation, that's when you actually love people more unconditionally. If you're doing things against your heart's will, for the sake of connection, you're deluding both of you. You know, because you're not in real connection, because you've disassociated from your actual reality in order to have a pseudo connection with someone else. So it's odd. The things that we do for connection that are actually guaranteeing disconnection, we do all the time. And getting in touch with that can be really heartbreaking. But that's a lot of the stuff we do at Sleepawake is understanding obligation, understanding resentment, trying to feel all the ways we disown our reality for the sake of safety and connection, and how
Mm-hmm.
we can graduate into a way where we take better care of ourselves. Um, yeah, and there's plenty more to say there.
Yeah. And yeah, like the question is when, because you might see this a lot in spiritual or personal development communities where somebody learns something new and it's like all of a sudden like I'm better than you because I know this and I know how to do this and you don't, and poor little you, I need to teach you now. Like this kind of like superior attitude can come on just because like the ego latches on. I don't know, something comes on with the ego on.
Yeah.
And just how I think how much of the whole being is necessary for, like I don't even know, to be able to approach that in a very open and compassionate way, knowing that there may be resistance, you know?
And what do you mean when you say to approach that? Like for who to approach
To
that?
approach, like to approach what you said, like bringing in this new way of relating to your own emotions and to others' emotions. Do
Yeah,
you
I
have
guess
any
the thing I'd say
tips?
is like, yeah, well, when I noticed, the kind of example you gave of the person who comes back and they're like, you guys need, um, that person might be a narcissist, but oftentimes it's just that they are so excited about how helpful
Mm-hmm.
something's been that they want to be of benefit. They're just doing it in an unskillful way, like you don't know this, you should learn this. But it comes from a good place. It comes from a wish to have people learn things that are important and powerful. And then I think the classic thing is like telling someone to do anything that's good for them, and it just doesn't work. Telling someone to go to the gym, like if you going to the gym doing exercise, pretty universally positive for people, but it's probably less than 1% of people who enjoy being told that they should go to the gym, and they'll feel better if they go to the gym. So there's just that kind of natural resistance to being told to do anything. So I
Right.
think what it comes down to a lot of the time is if I go to a retreat and I get exposed to something new and it really opens my eyes, and I don't do that thing where I'm like, you guys got to learn this, then
Mm-hmm.
what actually happens? What happens is I have to feel the heartbreak of the fact that the people around me don't know this thing. And so a lot of the time, that action of trying to get people to know something is covertly a way for me to avoid feeling the grief and heartbreak of the fact that people don't know this. And so many things that we do in our lives are covertly ways for us to not have to feel some difficult emotion.
And also like if you come back to your life with this realization and you then, apply it to yourself, and maybe, some people will just reject that, but then, they see it. You show it in a way without trying to show it off. It's just like it just becomes you, um, becomes integrated into you, becomes you.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah. My old meditation teacher who passed away a couple of years ago, Dan Brown. Um, he teaches Tibetan Buddhism, and at the end of the retreat, he would say, okay, you're going to go back into the world. Don't be a Buddhist. be a Buddha. Don't go back and tell everyone they need to learn Buddhism. Be the thing that you're learning
hmm
and let people be transformed in through the relationship with someone who's freer in themselves. And that's really powerful and much harder to do because the more I open up to these things, the more heartbreak I have to feel. When you actually let in more of the grief in the world that's happening because you open to your own grief, there's a lot there waiting. And people generally have very little idea of how much they're protecting themselves from the amount of pain that's going on in the world. And the more we open to it in ourselves, the more we see it. You walk on the street and you get better at seeing the level of dysfunction, the level of stress, the level of anxiety and depression in the world. And we do a lot to protect ourselves from feeling that reality because it's very uncomfortable. And if, I can't tell you, like, there's just times where I'm just walking on the street and I'm just crying because I see the default that we've taken for granted of what adulthood is in our world. And it's like cloudy skies all the time on some level. It's very rare that someone's like deeply and through their whole being feeling a sense of joyousness just at being, not because some party's coming up or some good specific thing happened, but just because they're existing. And I'm not pretending that that's the place I live all the time, but it's clear to me that that's actually a North Star that's possible and that we can move toward. But we have to be willing to feel everything to get in that way, to get along the way.
So is our mind the thing that is blocking us off from like feeling all of that? Does it just come back to the mind causing the suffering of not wanting? Because if how does the mind even block us off from feeling these things? It feels such a weird thing because separating the mind and the body. Like, what do you mean the mind and the thoughts can tell us not to do that, not to feel,
Yeah,
to go in
yeah,
a different
yeah.
direction?
It's a great question. I think a lens that I use for a lot of these things is evolution. So if you look at an animal like a dog, I have two dogs. Um, they don't know how to resist their experience. They don't know how to be in an experience and say, I don't want to be in this experience. That requires a huge level of cognitive capability. So they might be in pain and want to get away from the pain, but we can be in pain and imagine a reality that we're not in pain and then contrast the two and then wish we were in this other place. And that's a whole different type of pain that we, call suffering. So the meditation teacher Shinzen Young, he says, suffering is pain times resistance. So, and I can't tell you, like, in some meditation retreats, when you sit for long hours and you feel intense pain in your body, but you learn to actually just be with the sensation of the pain without the resistance, you learn very deeply in an embodied way that they're very different. And that if I drop the resistance to what's going on, the sensations might still be there, but they're free of suffering. And that's a very that's a rare form of knowledge in our world, but it's very possible and very easy for someone to learn if they're willing to actually lean into some of the pain and just say, okay, for example, I'm just going to sit in meditation posture for 60 minutes and I'm not going to let myself move. Like, I know I'm most likely not going to do permanent damage to my body, but let me tell you, when you hit the 40-minute mark, you're going to be counting the seconds. You're going to know that it should have, there's a malfunction on my alarm and it should have gone off already. Um, and all of that is to avoid the sensation. And that's suffering. And so that does require a certain type of thinking and a certain type of cognitive complexity that other animals don't have in the same way.
So, what's an example of using the mind as a tool rather than being used by the mind?
So when you just said that, my mind has to come online to understand that you're speaking English and you're asking me a question. And that's
hmm
absolutely critical. Like, we don't want to get rid of that. An ice pick would get rid of that, and it would cease us suffering, but it would also cease all the other beautiful
A
complexities that we can
lobotomy?
create. Exactly. Like, and that's where people get into confusion around these topics. What people call the pre-trans fallacy. Like, we can damage our brain and go to a state before we were able to do suffering in this way. But that's very different than the transcendence of suffering and
Mm.
actually getting in a deeper relationship with thinking as a tool. And people mess that up all the time. They say, oh, like a baby is in oceanic unified bliss. So that's what I should try to do, is get back to being a baby. No, no, no. You have to actually now have formed a personality, formed a sequence of thoughts. And now how does that entity get back in touch with unity? It's a very, very different phenomenon. So all of these dimensions, they evolved because they're incredibly powerful tools for a being, for an entity, right? The ability to create a three-dimensional world. How amazing. How amazing that I can find myself here, move around. I can tell you what downstairs is in my house, and I don't want to get rid of that. And similarly, when I'm constructing, um, whether it's constructing a map or making plans to build an airplane, I need the mind. I need symbolic and conceptual thought. And how amazing! Like when you really think about what it
Yeah.
is to make something like a plane, no other being that we know can set up that many steps, all of which on their own don't do anything useful for you. Like if I'm making the propeller, that's not useful. That doesn't help my survival. I have to make a million different things and put them together, and then all of a sudden I can get from San Francisco to Miami in 6 hours. That's incredible. And that's the power of thought. And so we wouldn't want to get rid of that. But what I track is that thought was created in an environment of scarcity, in an environment when we were hunter-gatherer cultures. We were, banging rocks on one another to get sharper edges, to be able to do these basic things better, to start to use tools. But that became such a powerful capability that it became compulsive. And now most people can't stop thinking. And that's the flip that you're referring to, is that now the mind is out of control. It was so useful that it just got overpowered. And now we're in a world where not only is that superpowered, but it's the educational system further superpowers it to be compulsive and to overanalyze. And then we have things like this that hijack, through the best specialists in the world,
Yeah.
know how to hijack all those
Mhm.
mammalian mechanisms to pull our attention and create grab. And so more and more we're sensitized to dysfunction. We are more and more sensitized towards suffering. We are more able to suffer from small things than ever before, you could argue. If you look at people 200 years ago that were taking boats over to new countries and then traveling on horseback for 6 weeks to, incredible things that were happening that most of us would just be scared out of our pants to try to do now. So I see that as a process of sensitization and the mind getting more and more sensitive, and then having more and more capability to suffer and be resistant to what's happening.
So I heard somewhere recently that we pride ourselves in like how complex the mind can be. Like we pride ourselves in our complex thinking. I mean, like your ability to create that map like was involved the complex thinking. Right. Good job, Jeff. You did it. You earned a
You
Nobel
did
Prize.
it.
Okay. But but
Any
then
day
it's
now.
right. It should be coming in. Hold on. Let me join this with a question I had.
Mhm.
Okay. So we have this mind and we can use it as a tool and it can create these cool maps and these airplanes and stuff like that. But like what about how do you join that with presence? Like the because I feel like that's the ultimate. Like that's the ultimate embodied awareness and use of the mind where you're when you're able to be fully present and not so overthinking and stuck in the mind, all of a sudden you have access, like in my experience, a lot more access to flow state, what people call flow state, right? And you have a lot more intuitive thinking and things may come to you easier. You're more focused because all of a sudden like you're actually you have a goal or you have something you're going towards, you're focusing on it and you're able to do it without
Mhm.
anything distracting you that's within your mind or externally. Like really like if something's externally distracting you, I mean that's your mind too in a way. Kind of. I mean depends. It depends on how much it's
Mhm.
distracting, like in what way, you know? I wanted to like distinguish between like is there a would you distinguish between self-awareness, like the metacognition and presence itself? Like being
Mhm.
self-aware, but then presence. Do you feel like that's two different things?
Yeah, I love that question. And once again, it can get into deep subtleties. I think a baby is incredibly present with no metacognitive self-awareness. So there's an easy example of how those two
Hmm.
things are separable. And what takes us out of presence is typically that something in the environment happens that activates a conditioned pattern in us that puts us in some kind of stress. And that usually gets the mind running to try to figure out how to get us out of that situation. So that's where that suffering and resistance come from. So, one way to look at what presence is to look at what takes us out of it. And it's usually, oh, something happened and now I feel that aloneness that I don't want to feel. So now all of a sudden my mind is
Hmm.
racing to change the situation, and there goes my presence. Otherwise, I was just here, I was just interacting with you. Um, and that contrast happens all the time. And I think people are present and might not have a name for it, but it happens all the time. You can just be taking a drive and you can be totally present on the road, or you can be taking a drive and be fully in your head. And then all of a sudden, like you pop at the destination, you don't even remember how you got there. Like, how did I make the right turns without getting in an accident? So there's the amazement of being able to learn something like driving and make it unconscious knowledge doesn't make it obvious that we're in presence or out of presence. But I think it's usually the stress of feelings that we don't feel comfortable feeling that takes us out of that presence.
Yeah, because like for example, right now, I'm feeling like a little bit of anxiety. Not like a super big amount, but just like a little bit, it's like there. And it almost feels like to my mind thinks that I benefit from not having that anxiety, or I'm a better person right now if I don't have that anxiety. So,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like if I just go into it, like I feel like I'm gonna disconnect from being here in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. The irony being, it is the thing that is being here, right?
Yeah.
Before I label it as anxiety, there's just sensation arising right now. And when that's one of the practices when we start to look at grab, you know, oh, I have a sensation, I'm uncomfortable with it, I'm going to label it anxiety. What am I anxious about? All of a sudden, it starts to spin into this whole world, right? And now I've lost my
Yeah.
presence. What is it to actually just feel the sensation? That's where the presence comes back. And as you know, I think pretty well, and I won't go into any kind of personal details, but like as you know from being in a place like camp, there's gold that comes from learning to sit with the sensation and actually just be like, oh, there's a sensation. And it has information for me.
It just feels
Anxiety
like
has information for me.
it feels like I know it's like what's in front of you is what's most relevant right now, but it feels like it's a just to me my mind makes it my mind believes that it is a distraction towards what goal I want to accomplish in a
Mhm.
way, but it's not. Because it's like
Yeah, it's
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 part
kind
of
of like
it.
I think there's like a lens that's a little like mathy, but I'm trying to use non-mathy language to get at it. Um, Locally and globally, right? There's things that are good or bad for us locally, and there are things that are good or bad for us globally. And if I need to be doing something and I have anxiety come in, locally, it might feel like, oh, I should get rid of this so I can do this thing. But probably what's going to happen over the course of my life is that same thing is going to come in thousands of times and thousands of times because I've never actually looked at it once or the roots of it.
Hmm.
And so globally, it can be very deeply in my benefit to go all the way into it and understand what it is. And one of the things we talk about around anxiety at camp is anxiety is not an emotion on its own. It's a fear of that emotion. And so when I look into anxiety, it's like I'm anxious of what? Oh, I'm anxious that I'm going to feel sad. And so it itself is an energy that's trying to get away from that sadness, or it's trying to get me away from fear or shame. And that anxiety is a whole secondary kind of response to that emotion. So if I slow things down, which is, one part that comes up all the time in this kind of work, is like the mind wants to race through and get to the next thing. How do I get rid of the anxiety? How do I just do this task? If I slow it down, all of a sudden I'll feel the sensations more crisply and more subtly. If I start to do practices like Nadera or the bioemotive framework to try to put words to those sensations, what is it exactly that I'm feeling? Oh, I'm unworthy and I'm going to get rejected. If I actually say that, then it's going
Oh
to
yeah.
flood my system, the reality of that feeling. And now I'm not getting away from it at all. Now I'm feeling the reality of it. And probably images will come to mind of the earliest times that I felt unworthy and rejected. And I'm going to feel the pain of those things. But all that's been in there, it's been in my backpack that I carry around all the time. And so actually giving it the attention to be felt, be seen, and then actually leave, leave by going through it, not by pushing it away. Then it discharges. Then I start to get less and less in full belief of that thing. And that's when the grab gets lower and lower. And eventually I can say, oh, look, there's that feeling of aloneness. That's my history, but I'm not inside surrounded by it anymore. It's a wave of sensation.
And yeah, I love at camp how we were given the opportunity, like while we were in this, big circle together, to name that. Like when that was coming up for a person, they had the opportunity to literally just say that in front of the whole group.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's probably the vision to bring that out into the world as a whole, but the world doesn't feel like that. Like I would love the world to be like that. We can just like, this is how I'm feeling. This is the communication for my feeling, and to allow that be. But I feel like if I just said that in the workplace, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be taken this way, that way, and then la 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 la, and then all the thoughts go.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah,
this is why for me, my deepest interest is around cultural norms and how to shift cultural norms. Because what I find is I learned these things and I had similar thoughts. And then when I started a business like this with Kat, our norm is that those are part of business meetings, you know, because it's
yeah.
relevant to our work. And if we're ignoring the feelings that are coming up as we're making business decisions, then we're just doing it from our minds that are avoiding some core intelligence of what's going on. And so we are regularly in business meetings where someone says, oh, this is bringing up some kind of sense of helplessness here. And it's like, okay, well, we're not going to have a clear decision on what to do without feeling that helplessness. If we don't feel that helplessness, our whole decision is going to be a decision that is covertly to get us away from feeling helpless. And so you could argue that so much of our culture is doing that all the time.
Hmm.
So what I have found is that, you learn these things and I think you're having wisdom where you're like, oh yeah, I couldn't just bring this up maybe in my work, but maybe I want to eventually work in a place where I can. And maybe I want to do that in several ways. Maybe I'm going to start working with some friends who have done this kind of work. And so that's the norm at our business. Maybe I'm going to start making it important for more of the culture to get exposed to this kind of work. All these different ways
Yeah.
to enact it. But as I've
Infiltrate.
gotten more and more, yeah, yeah, that's one lens on it. Um, if it's important to me, then I will start to say no to the things that don't align with that, and it'll make more space for the things
Mhm.
that do. And so now, I've founded two companies, Wonder Machines, as you said, and Sleep Awake, and both of those, it's all welcome. It's really hard to imagine something that someone could say in those meetings where it would be like, actually, this is not welcome here. And that's rare in our culture now, but I
Yeah.
think eventually it will be more the norm. And that's not to, there's still plenty of times it's like, okay, we have to transition now because we only have this much time left to make
Yeah.
certain decisions. There's practical concerns because it's easy to like swing the pendulum too far, and it's like we're going to do
Hmm.
2 hours of emoting and then have 4 minutes to
Yeah.
make decisions.
That's yeah,
Um,
same thing that came up at camp where we wanted to continue and make more space, and then only these people can share, and then people felt like they had less time. That concern came up, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's practical concerns, but right now the pendulum in most of our culture is that there should be a very deep separation between the fullness and emotionality in our beings and the work we do. And all I would say is that leads to a certain type of work in the world. If I were looking at a company like Facebook, I have to go into a really deep question to ask, has that been beneficial for humans? Right? It's obviously there's good things about it, but also what else is going on with our attention and with our sense of connection,
Hmm.
and those are complex. And I think some of that is because that's not the way the business like that was built. It wasn't built with like, okay, what is this going to do? How do I feel about a system like this? You know how many social media founders don't let their own children use the things that they created? It's the statistics are wild, right?
But
So
it's
that means
crazy.
there's a
Yeah.
lack of coherence between what they're doing and what their heart says.
Do you
That's
feel
very deep.
this has to do with like our internal masculine and feminine energies, or is it more like heart and mind in coherence? Because I feel like when think
How
of
would you see it in the masculine and feminine dynamic?
like when I think of masculine, I feel like I have a goal. I want to do this. I'm gonna do this no matter what. I don't care how you feel. I don't care how I feel. Like this is something I want to accomplish. And feminine is more like intuition, flow, like a lot more of the feeling. That's how I kind of do it in my mind. How
Mm.
how do you do it in your mind with the
Yeah, well,
masculine feminine thing?
yeah, sometimes just because people have so many cultural interpretations of the words masculine and feminine,
Yeah.
I will use initiatory and receptive.
Okay.
There's an initiatory energy that plunges into the world, like you're saying, kind of go, let's go make that happen. And there's a receptivity of like, let me really listen. And both are incredible, right? Both are necessary in this universe. So there's
Yeah.
no judgment about them. But when they get out of balance, either of them has problems. And so in this lens that you're bringing in, I would say, yeah, there's a lot of initiatory energy, like let's make Facebook, that isn't receptive to the fullness of the feelings that are around building a system like that. I'm going to oversimplify by saying if you watch a movie like The Social Network and you look at the founding of Facebook, what was the energy going on in Zuckerberg? The energy was, I want to fit in. I want to be accepted by this other group, and I'm going to build this thing so I can be one of the cool guys, right? That's the energy that was going on, which is a shadow element. If someone isn't actually letting themselves feel, oh, I feel alone and I feel
Mm-hmm.
separate and I want to satisfy that. So we try to make something to not feel that aloneness. And now that's one of the things that in my lens has transmuted into a system like Facebook. It makes people more feel in and out group stuff and the need to connect and a need for status. And that's kind of the like buttons and all that kind of stuff. It gets transmuted because it hasn't been felt through fully. Like, what are the actual repercussions of a system like this? So it's the imbalance of those energies that seems to cause danger.
Yeah, and with social media, I mean, there's so much. My sister is 9 years old and she's already like, I mean, she's exposed to TikTok. I mean, it's just in the environment, like all her friends pretty much. And
Hmm.
it's like, all the trends and wanting to go viral. Look how many more subscribers I gain. Like and, and like, again, like these platforms are so amazing at connecting people. But at the same time, like in my perspective, they're mainly used to make sure that I fit in. Like I want to make sure I fit in, so I'm going to create this in a way in the same way that Facebook would market something to get your attention. Like that's how we're taught to work the algorithm of something. We need to now follow the intention of what Facebook said initially so that we can get big or whatever. Or get into the algorithm, as people say. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
have
There's
yeah, I have a I have a I think personal problem with marketing because I know marketing is so important. It's so important to be able to market yourself and to have the skill of selling. But I really like I know this is like probably I'm taking this really personally or something because I have a very strong like resistance towards all of that like for many many years. And I don't know where the strong resistance came from, but I'm just very like I just really don't like how we're approaching all of this. And this caused me to kind of not have much of an identity in a sense. Like I just let go too much in a sense where I'm just like, oh, I just didn't let myself have any kind of identity. And then I would judge people that would be confident even in themselves. So I just took it to an extreme in that way, but yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a travesty. If you look at the statistics, especially around adolescent girls with exposure to social media, um, self-harm, suicide has just skyrocketed. And it's because, it seems pretty obvious that it's because more than ever, I can compare myself to other people. And I'm so sensitive now to how I compare myself to other people that might be fitting in more, having more or less, showing me that it's important to have more or less of that thing. And remember, like I was saying, the evolution of us is towards greater sensitivity, right? you talk to someone from the 1500s about like, I'm not getting enough likes on this thing, and they're just going to be like, what are you doing? Do you have enough corn in your field? That's what I'm sensitive to, right? So we've built these niches of sensitivity, but they become reified and they have so much grab that we get, our mental health suffers really deeply. And it's very sad. And it's like, I think you pointed towards maybe there are personal aspects of what's coming up, but I say a lot of the time we have personal hypersensitivities to these things, but at their root, we're sensitive to something that is a wisdom that actually is saying there's something going on here that doesn't sit right with my heart. And then if we do the work to actually work through, like, what is this bringing up in me? Then I'm actually in a place to do something about it. I'm not being reactive to the thing. It's very, very easy to be like, F you, Facebook, right?
Yeah.
And then some people do that, but that doesn't change much about Facebook, right? It's a whole different thing to say, actually, like, what? Let's feel the complexity of this. Let's feel the motivations that they have in making this. Let's feel all the other factors in society that are supporting this thing to exist. And then how do I actually want to engage in that or not? And I'm not recommending anyone engage, but it's like there's different attitudes about like leaving a system and hoping that that helps it dissolve, or being in a system to try to iterate and evolve it towards our well-being, right? That's always a kind of a conundrum that people fall into.
Would you have any tips in like trusting your intuition, but also knowing when it may be like a stronger emotional reactivity rather than an intuition, like the distinction, intuition and a reactivity?
Mm,
Because
mm.
I
A great
experience
great
that a
question.
lot, and sometimes I get confused personally.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say is the needing to know which it is can be paralyzing in itself. And so I'd say if there's a signal and you act on the signal, then it updates the information that you're getting. And then you can make another change. And so you might not know at first if something's intuition or your own sensitivity, but if you do something and you change the situation, now you have a different lens on what's going on. And that can be where the insight comes, like this was intuition. I'd say under that, there are times you kind of have to develop a sensitivity to what the intuitive voice feels like to hear. And there's at its root, when a voice of intuition comes in, it feels very clear, calm about the intuition, and there's something like unshakable about it. And when there's a hypersensitivity, there might be a sense of a rush to act or to change something or to get away from something. And it takes interoceptive practice and practice in feeling your energetic body to understand how those voices can be different. And that's subtle work. That's not just like someone has a new way to differentiate them. That said, there's one, I forget, I wish I could quote who this is, but I saw a video one time and someone was talking about it in the sense of how do you know uh, intuition versus fantasy, which is a kind of a adjacent question. And the woman said, um, intuition will always scare you. Fantasy will feel like, oh, I'm going to go do this thing. It's going to be amazing. Intuition will be like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. Oh man, okay. Like, what do I have to put at stake to do that? When I had the intuition to make this camp, it brought up a ton of things I had to feel through in order to make that actually happen. And so it had that scariness to it. It's like when we have intuition, it's usually pulling us towards a greater, bigger, more fully lived aspect of ourselves. And the only reason that aspect hasn't come online is because we have resistance to it or conditioning from happening, from keeping that from happening. So it's almost like a necessity that as our intuition pulls us towards a growth, that's through patterns of resistance. And so that's one of the things that I sense into. It's like, is my intuition for what I'm going to do next scary, or does it feel like a fantasy? And if it feels like a fantasy, then there's work for me to do to look at under the hood about what I'm secretly avoiding through this intuition.
It's so interesting. What do you define as intuition? Like what is intuition for
Mm,
you?
mm. There's a sense of knowing of something that is in deep alignment and coherence for me at my root. And I differentiate that from like um, as you're saying, the kind of things that arise that are actually like reactive sensitivities, where if I really am honest with myself and I look to the root of that voice or that vision or that image, um, it's it's not in full alignment and coherence with myself. It itself has some level of avoidance or resistance to reality in some way.
This is so interesting because when it comes to like the topic of intuition, what direction to go in, and resistance, things get so like things get so crazy. Cause like, cause oh my gosh, cause listen, I listen to a lot of Bashar and Abraham Hicks. Like they really helped me get back into a good feeling state, and they do talk a lot about the good feeling state, like being able to find pathways towards feeling good within the present moment, you know? But also, like, yeah, like when I do want to do certain things that feel like resonant with my body, like with all of me, like feel resonant, like, yes, I want to do this, that does also bring up a lot of fears sometimes. So, so, but do you know Bashar's formula? Like follow your excitement to the best of your ability with no insistence on the outcome. So it's like follow your excitement, best of your ability, no insistent on the outcome. Like don't attach to the outcome, but just go towards where you feel most inspired to go to.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel like that meshes with going towards your resistance? Because I heard this from Teal Swan, where she was like, go towards your resistance, but also get aligned before you do any other action. And I'm like,
Yeah.
all these things together. I'm like, I still don't know how to put all this like into
Yeah. No,
cohesively.
it's great that you're in that question. Like if you if you're following your excitement and you're being honest that this is my deepest excitement, like my excitement was to make Sleepawake 4 years
Mhm.
ago. That brought up so much resistance. And I could hold those both as like, of course, it's going to bring up resistance. It's going to be a level of holding that I've never done before. It's going to be a level of responsibility. It's like we're putting the fate, not to overstate it, but like we're putting mental health in our hands in a different level. And so, of course, it brought up resistance. And if I was fantasizing about it, I just would have not felt any of that. I'd be like, oh yeah, we're gonna have this and this and this, and I would have been ignoring a lot, and it would have like the what do they call it? The chickens would have come home to roost at some point. Like there would have had to be a moment of reckoning where I get more in touch with all the things I had been avoiding. So to me, it goes together because my highest excitement is always going to be evolving me,
Mhm.
right? It's
Yeah.
always going to be evolving me, and evolution. You know the term eustress, like positive stress. Like as we change and go through things, it's stressful. And if we think that we can set up a life that avoids that, well, I guess I'll say like we can set up our lives to avoid that, but it's not a growth path.
That's like
It's
the
a comfort
samskara.
orientation.
Like the
Yeah, it's kind of
samskara,
like
yeah.
yeah, like living just choosing to live in that bubble, right? And we can try to orient our lives to do that. And for some temporary amounts of time, we can do it. But the guarantee at the end is that that's not going to work out, right? We're all headed into the same direction at the end. So to me, there is this deep coupling, and the honesty has to come from the kind of timbre, the flavor of that excitement. Is that thing exciting in this way that's like really like
Hmm.
fidgety excitement because I
Hmm.
because I secretly am going to use it to get away from something painful? Or is it the kind of excitement like, whoa, if we built this, this would be an amazing thing in the world. And wow, it scares the crap out of us to build
Like
this because of the real
bigger
repercussions of it.
picture, like bigger picture for a bigger purpose, you could say, like more embodied.
Yeah.
There's all these words you could use.
Yeah,
But
like
I
I
guess,
know with I know with you that you talk about a lot like expression, singing expression,
uh-huh.
etc. And so it's a great example because there's clearly an excitement for that that's coming from your internal coherent self. And it's clearly going to bring up resistance, right? Because I'm putting myself out there more. I'm trying to dive into my deepest vulnerable voice while having it heard. It would be the
Yeah.
kind of fantasy version if you weren't letting yourself feel all those resistances,
Like
right? So
what's the
that
yeah.
excitement, it has resistance part and parcel of it.
Oh yeah, like the fantasy version is that, or for example, even with this podcast, like the fantasy version is that I can just like talk to you, be in full 100% presence the whole time and just like flow.
Yeah, and you're gonna be famous in 3 months, kind of thing,
Yeah, right.
right? That's often lumped into it, right? Oh, I'm gonna make a podcast and I'm
Yeah.
gonna be, everyone's gonna like it. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's a heartbreaking, it's reminding me of this heartbreaking thing. You were talking earlier about the kind of shifts in our culture. And the BBC, I think it was, did a study like 40 years ago. They asked children, they were like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the top things were like, I want to be a police officer, I want to be a teacher. And they did it again like 10 years ago. And the top things were famous, influencer,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, and this is fantasy. Because what does it even mean to be an influencer if you don't have something that's getting transmuted by that
Yeah.
influence? Right? That's how wild the kind of systems have gotten, where the only thing I care
Mm-hmm.
about is that I'm influencing.
Then people
Well, who should
go,
be influencing?
yeah. And then people go viral, and then they didn't have a foundation of what they were wanting to bring to people, and then like a lot can happen then, basically.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think one of the weirdest things about this kind of work, the work that I do, is it's it's usually oriented towards the things that people have spent most of their life avoiding. It's not the easy, flashy thing to get viral, because it's usually about people's resistance. As anyone that comes to our camp program, it's like we talk to them in advance, we do interviews, and it's like, hey, resistance is going to come up here. This is not a party with pinwheels and stuff like that. It's like, hey, you've spent 25 years avoiding these things, and they're probably going to come up when you're here. So it's not the kind of thing that has a natural virality to it. There are so many easy ways to go viral with something if you play to the lowest common denominator of what this social monkey is, right? It's basically give the right kind of sugar pill. And so when we have systems like social media that are laser amplifiers of things, they commonly play to the least common denominator, of what is the easiest thing to spread. And it doesn't matter what the package is that's being spread. And if we build different systems of social media that actually foundationally care about the messages that are being transmitted instead of just virality and likes, will create totally different social mechanisms for us to evolve with each other. And that's a whole different world that
Mm-hmm.
I think we're headed towards, but
Yeah.
it's partially in response to the world that we've created now.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's in transition towards that? Like, do you feel like we're somewhere
I
in the
do.
transition, like
I
along the
do.
way a
I
little
think,
bit?
yeah, absolutely. I actually, I take a pretty holistic, like evolutionary scale look at these things. And when you see technology has done this in the last 30 years, remember when I was in high school, there was no internet to use, right?
Yeah.
5 years ago, there was no AI on people's minds. It's like everyone's using it now. Everyone's using the internet foundationally as a part of their life, right? So tech is doing this. Sorry, I'll do it this way for the Zoom. Tech is doing this, and mental health is doing this by all the measures, especially around adolescents, young adults. That is going to hit a crash point. It's already, in my mind, hitting a crash point. But people are basically falling off the plank of our society and the kind of runway that we've created for society. So more and more people with depression, anxiety, and stress are waking up to the fact that that's actually an intelligent response to the level of dysfunction in our society. And instead of treating themselves as malfunctioning, they're saying, oh, wait a second. I'm the canary in the coal mine. I'm the sensitive being that's the first one to say in my community, this isn't good. This isn't actually serving us. We were tribal people. We need each other. We need to be interdependent with one another, not through optical illusions of interdependence, through actual back and forth, us needing each other, us building things together. We've largely lost touch with that, and we can live in the illusion that we're independent because I DoorDash my food and I can live without ever leaving my apartment now, and it ignores the underlying incredible amount of interdependence that all of that is based on. And we are feeling the hurt of having lost touch with that. And I think that is the wake up call that's going to bring us back to build the systems that reconnect us to each other. So all in all, I feel, who knows if all these huge forces, like where that's going to end up. But I definitely think that the wide view of things like increasing depression is that people are waking up to the fact that this is not actually going in the direction that serves the fullness of our human being.
Right. And sometimes when children like feel that and express that, like they don't have any authority, you know? So then they
Mhm.
repress that and then yeah, anyway, I feel like that's a lot of the worth issues come from. I mean, personally, that's what I resonate with, like the worth
Mhm.
being the main thing. So the roles that we have in society, I feel like they're a limiting factor in us being able to meet authentically, but also they do have their place, obviously. But how would you say that we can go beyond roles and truly meet each other without illusion? I have this Eckhart Tolle quote where he said that like we're acting out the script without realizing because we're completely right identified with the script and the role. And so then, like you've spoken about earlier, we're just what was it that you used?
Yeah, like for example, when we act out of obligation, we're
Yes,
repressing aspects of self for the sake of connection, but it's guaranteeing that the real self isn't going to be connected.
that's exactly. Yep, but there you go. That's right. So, so how can we like truly like meet each other? Like how can that like how does that happen? How can that happen?
Yeah, so two things come to mind to kind of start that part of the conversation. One of them is, um, we talked a little bit about the pre-trans fallacy, kind of how sometimes things feel the same if I revert back to something before, or if I transcend that thing. So in terms of roles, I don't think roles are intrinsically bad. I think they're really beautiful. The complexity of our society demands differentiation. And the fact that there are some people that are teachers as a career and some people that are farmers is in itself beautiful and necessary for a complex society. Now, roles didn't used to exist that way, right? If I'm a little rat and I have my little ratling baby, um, I'm just I'm just that, right? But that doesn't allow a certain complexity of society to exist in rats, right? As humans, there's a million different roles being played, and all of them are actually pretty interdependent and require one another. Like I wouldn't be able to be having this podcast with you without all the farmers growing our food for sure as a starting point, much less the people that know how to build this house, right? It used to be like all of us knew how to build our own house and all of us knew how to get our own food. Um, so, what a beautiful evolution. However, what you could say is that at this phase of our evolution, we are overly identified with our roles. We are overly concrete about our roles. And so if I'm a teacher at a school, I'm taking that damn seriously, that my whole well-being is based on how people treat me as a teacher in that role, how the students treat me as that role, how the faculty of the school or the principal or the superintendent, like those things are really serious to me. Now, I assume you're familiar with Alan Watts. He's a great author of spiritual texts, and he has this book called The Book. And in it, one of the chapters is called How to Be an Authentic Fake. And it's a really beautiful, even just that line, I find as a really beautiful line. And what he's pointing to is like what would it be to be a teacher, but to be enlightened? It would mean that you've transcended the solidity of that role, but you'd still be playing the role. And it would be, it would be obvious from your perspective that it was just a role that was being played, just like wearing a certain kind of jacket. But still, in those interactions, people might not be aware of that. You would just be pretty easeful about how tightly that role was held. It wouldn't be defining you. It wouldn't be defining your worth or your sense of identity or your sense of how much you can get connection. It would just be like a theater role that you were playing. And from that perspective, you'd actually have a lot more fluidity in your ability to be powerful in that role because you wouldn't be totally subjugated by the structures of the role dynamics. You'd actually see them as dynamics and you'd see them as constantly in a state of fluid evolution. And so that would free you. So you get to be a fake, you get to fake like you're a teacher, but you know internally that you're just playing that's the clothes that you put on. for the day. And this is funny because it's like this comes up for me all the time. We run this camp, and I'm teaching, and so it's like I get
You're
to step
Jeff.
in that role. I go from just being Jeff who's hanging out in his house to being Jeff the teacher. And there's ways that I could lose myself in that because I need to be fed by playing that role. And this happens especially in spiritual communities all the time, where the guru is an amazing realized person. They've had a lot of awakening, they've had a lot of internal evolution, but they also covertly need to be seen as an important being. So they'll create an entire spiritual community that solidifies the role of teacher. And they won't actually be clear of that role. They'll be getting fed by their shadow uh, through that role, not by their shadow. Their shadow will be getting fed. Their need for power, their need for control will be getting fed by holding solidly to that role. It's a very, and I had to notice as I've done more facilitation and teaching and be honest with myself. And it's one of the reasons we work with a big group of facilitators is like, what am I trying to take from playing this role? And how do I be really honest with myself? Because there are ways where it feels really good to be a teacher, right? There's a natural love in that, and it's beautiful. It's not something that I would judge. But if my sense of self-worth comes from the fact that I'm teaching, that gets really dangerous. And that's where shadow comes in. And that's why you have all these just so many I forget what the word is, where teachers getting found out for having done horrible things.
Hmm.
It's like almost a trope at this point. It's almost
Like
the
a
default
false
is that
guru or something like that.
yeah, like that happens all the time. There's scandals.
Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
like more than half of the spiritual communities in the last like 50 years that get any notoriety. It's like there's some scandal that comes out. Like secretly that teacher was being abusive in some way.
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of these communities don't have a system of checks and balances of the shadow of how are these people being served by playing this role. It's a real thing to be honest about.
Yeah, that's a big one. Like, how do we navigate the experience of like being in presence and in our true nature, and also in your identity with the world, and kind of like I tie identity with like your bigger mission or your, because every person's unique and every person has different talents that they bring to the table. So I think it's so important to be able to self-recognize that for yourself rather than deny yourself of having anything to offer. Like I feel like I've done for a long time, that doesn't help anybody. Like if
Mm.
you're self-critical and oh, I have nothing, like okay, that doesn't actually help the ecosystem around you if you feel like you're nothing, like that you have nothing to offer. So I'm trying to balance this, these concepts of these very like real things of like having something to offer and kind of having an identity around it or like a role in this world that can function, for the function of it, but also not getting attached to it. Like, whoa, that's a big one.
Yeah, I think it really requires deep self-honesty, and a community of support can make that much more easeful, because we are the last people to see our blind spots. Sometimes it's very easy from the outside to see someone's blind spots, but to look at ourselves and say, like, what's my blind spot right now? That takes a lot of practice and a lot of self-honesty. And so just like the kind of first roles, right? The first role is like, I'm a mom, I'm a dad, right? These are the very, very low level roles. And, as part of those roles, there are things that need to be done as a father. You have to take responsibility for this baby. Um, and how much does that change if that becomes my identity instead of a role that I'm playing? That's the thing that this conversation is teasing apart a little bit. And if I think all
Identity.
of a sudden, if I think that how my son does in school reflects my sense of self-worth, then I've made it an identity instead
So
of just a role.
is identity like, or when you're saying identity, do you mean the ego structure or do you mean like the ego attachment?
Yeah, like ego, I would say is It's can be many forms of identity, and people use that word in different ways, which is one of the
Right.
reasons I'm trying to make a map to disambiguate. But
Right.
yeah, generally speaking, like when I take on an identity, that is a form of ego. Anything that can change is in some sense some form of ego. Any identity that can change. Like there's an identity that I have that doesn't change, that doesn't feel any different than it felt like the first moment I was born. And that's not an ego structure. But my role as a teacher, my role as a parent, all those things change. And if I don't think of them as impermanent and changing, but I think of them as what I found fundamentally am, then so much is at stake. Because if I lose my
Right.
job, I'm going to go into
Yeah.
the deepest depression because that was my
Yeah.
identity and it's broken now. If it's just a role, then it's like, well, what's the next chapter?
So what is so who are you? Like who are we? What is the true nature? Like are we the like from your model's perspective, is it that we are just the universe, the consciousness experiencing all of this? But also like do you believe that there's like a soul that has maybe its past lives or whatever its history and it I don't and this like archetypal mission of like each person is like their hero and their main character, because it's like also like affirmations like when people say certain affirmations, now is that identification? I am a strong woman. Like, I don't know. Like, is that not, am I identifying as a strong woman? Or I am this person,
Right.
or I am really good at this thing, but then I don't like, like, I feel like affirmations can get people lost in identity a lot, but at the same time, they can help you. I was like crazy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one thing I'd say is like from the teachers that I've had, you you eventually want to transcend and include the ego. But the first thing that's important is to get a really healthy ego. You don't want to skip that step. A lot of people skip the step into like I'm not the ego structure. While the ego has all this kind of dysfunction,
Yeah.
and that also needs to be dealt with. And so eventually the paths of psychology and spirituality merge. But at first they seem really separate. And working on the ego structure and actually bringing health to the ego structure and making it a healthy, strong ego is really important for natural adult development. And the more healthy that is, the more easy it is to get into spirituality and transcendence of those structures. And it seems like people skip those
Hmm.
steps because it's uncomfortable to be in an ego structure, and that's where deep shadow elements emerge.
So I know we're ending soon, but one thing like I definitely skipped that step because when I got into this kind of
Mm.
spiritual realm, again, I was 12, 13, and I read something about you need to disidentify with anything. You're the pure awareness. So I'm like, okay, I'm pure awareness. So then I don't have an identity and I don't have like so I have this like so I developed a lot of like problems from that. From beginning like that. But it also gave me,
Mm.
insight from my personal experience. But let's see. Like, with this last question, do you experience yourself as like I'm Jeff the ego and I experience the world, or are you like more how do you experience yourself?
Um, Jeffness is arising all the time. It's not the whole of the picture, but it is relatively persistent. It comes up. It's the thing that wakes up in the morning, you could say. Um, there is people would use different words for it. There is a wakefulness or a background awareness that is there prior to the content of Jeff arising, but it doesn't mean that Jeff doesn't arise. And I think that's where people get towards nihilism, or what you were kind of pointing to with your earlier exposure. Like when people haven't formed the healthy ego structure, then wow, watch out. You know, it can really leave people spinning to kind of get exposed to awareness before that. Um, and but the funny thing about spirituality, and one of the kind of core paradoxes of it, is that you're not ever finding something that you weren't. You're just finding out something that you were already. And it's more of like a that's like seems to be the biggest puzzle because the ego misinterprets that it's going to get a better ego out of the spiritual process. That's the whole kind of trap. Spirituality is being learned by the ego, and the ego is trying to use it to
Mm-hmm.
get away from itself. And man, the games people play with that one, myself included, just many, many years of just total games, and I'm sure I'm playing games with myself all the time still. Um, but whatever any saint has ever gotten in touch with, they've always said, this is what I was before I got in touch with it. I just didn't know. And so that can become a really beautiful litmus test of how honest I might be about my spiritual practice. Am I am I orienting towards like I need to get away from this stuff so I form a better version of myself? That is not what spirituality is pointing to. Spirituality is pointing to getting in touch with my foundational nature, the ground of my being, what I have always been. As Ken Wilber says, what was my face before my parents were born?
And is your
This
ground the same as
original.
my ground? Is it the same ground? It's all the same ground.
I
So
would
it's just
I
the
would
same
say
thing.
yes. I would say yeah,
Yeah.
there it's hard to be in touch with that ground and then differentiate it from someone else's ground to find any quality that would let me say that it's not the same.
Yeah.
And
It's
so it's
cool. We
kind of like
just
the onus is on the person who can prove otherwise.
mm. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I wanted to give you a space at the end here to kind of let us know about Sleep
Mm,
Awake and the upcoming camp, because I know there's an upcoming camp coming up. So for young adults that are interested, listen
yeah,
up.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds great. So this coming year, we're not running a 30-day over the summer. We're running a couple 9-day programs. The first one is in the end of February in Santa Cruz, California. So anyone that's interested can go to sleepawake.camp. It's a play off the word sleepaway camp, sleepawake.camp. They'll see information about the immersive. So they can sign up to have a call with one of us and learn more about it. There's plenty of info on the site. And we'll have another one of those probably in May or June, but we haven't settled the dates yet. We also, especially in the Bay Area, we have uh, evening events once in a while. We have weekend events, so they can sign up for the mailing list and get exposed to them as well. And then finally, just because we talked about it, this map I've been developing, you can find at theopensource.life, and you'll see the video there, and you can get in touch with me about any of these things, and we can have a call to discuss.
Awesome. And I'll put all those links, down below as they go. Yeah, so thank
Yeah.
you so much. Any final any final words? Yeah, it was really great
Just
having you on here. Yeah.
yeah, it's just yeah, thank you for reaching out and having me on, and it's just fun to get to talk post camp and just kind of reconnect. So I
Yeah.
appreciate taking the time and you taking the time, yeah, to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you. All right, everybody, check out Jeff's stuff down below and Sleepaway Camp. Oh, and it's for young adults. So are you still doing 18 to 30
It,
years roughly or
roughly 18 to 30. If someone is outside the bounds of that, but it feels like a good match, reach out and have a conversation with us. We're trying to just find cohesion in the group more than anything.
yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you somewhere in the ground.
Thanks, Maya.
Yeah. Maya is illusion. So anyway, okay, we're gonna end it up here. Bye, everybody.